Welcome to October's Lunch and Learn, and thank you for joining me today. I wanted to take a moment to thank Shumla for providing the resources to conduct this research and the opportunity to share my findings today. And this afternoon, I'm going to be exploring some of the developments made by the Lower Pecos artists in the murals studied as part of the Hearthstone project. I'm also going to share a compositional analysis of Panther Cave and talk about how Lower Pecos artists used representation, but also abstraction in their paintings. I wanted to start today just by sharing a bit about my background. I'm a studio artist and I've been professionally painting since 2012. And in my practice, I explore surface and mark making and how we represent landscape. Through my research with Shumla, I use my experience as a studio artist to explore the painting process of the Lower Pecos artists. I began working with Shumla in 2017 through a graduate internship, and more recently, I've been able to collaborate with the Shumla team on the Hearthstone project. So this project involves a multidisciplinary approach that incorporates science and archaeology, ethnography, and also art analysis to understand several aspects of the paintings in this region. I've been able to study composition and types of mark making to understand the importance of painting as a vehicle for expression for the Lower Pecos narrative. Through history, we can see how artists piece together art elements to create compelling works of art. So for instance, the gold flake and flattened backdrops of Gothic art, the development of point perspective and vanishing points in Renaissance art, the striking use of value to create intensity and depth in a Caravaggio painting, and even as Impressionist artists broke the mold and experimented with color and expressive marks, we have made all of these things part of our language for talking about art. And throughout history, artists have used different systems of painting and visual expression to convey their own cultural concepts. While there are centuries of research outlining and diving into Western art developments, there's still a need for scholarship of some of the earliest works of art, including Lower Pecos murals. So this presentation is going to explore visual elements of the Pecos River style. Lower Pecos artists shared some of the same visual implements that we would recognize from Western art, things like shape, line, form, and color. And while we can't directly map Western art conventions like line or form onto prehistoric art, we can see them present in the murals that the Lower Pecos artists created. So while perhaps not accurate to the way that the Lower Pecos painters saw their art and their process, this is a vocabulary that we have for describing what we see in the murals. And through these implements, we can see that the painter is able to create a cohesive and a well-composed scene. From my perspective as a painter, I've concentrated on studying these rock art sites as works of art. I was able to visit Halo Shelter in 2021 and Fate Bell in 2022 for on-site measurements. And most recently, I was able to study Panther Cave in depth thanks to the maps and figure photography provided by the Shumla team. The focus of this talk will be on the pictographs of the Lower Pecos Canyonlands located in Southwest Texas and Northern Mexico. And this is noted by the red circle on the map here. And these murals are known for their diversity of figures and styles and arrangement. Due to a unique combination of ecological and geological factors, rock shelters in the Lower Pecos contain some of the best preserved remnants of hunter-gatherer ways of life, from 13,000 years ago up to European contact. And as a result, this region is considered one of the most significant archaeological regions in the world. The rock art of this region found in these canyon shelters is incredibly preserved. Through the research of the Hearthstone project, Shumla has demonstrated that these murals date back up to 5,000 years. Here you can see the four styles seen in this region, which are used individually or in combination with each other to create intricate compositions. So some of these are red monochrome, red linear, and historic period. But the focus of my talk today is going to be the Pecos River style shown here. And this is one of the four dominant styles in this area. The Pecos River style murals of this region vary in size. So some of them are tucked away in small enclosures, but some of them are huge and spanning up to 100 feet wide or even 20 feet high. And to paint high areas of the rock wall, a type of scaffolding system would have been essential. So here you can see an image from Black Cave where there is a group of figures high up on the panel here. And also note the detail of these figures on the right, the crisp lines and dots that would have required the artist to be really up close to the surface to create. And here, the site I'll be talking about today, Panther Cave, you can see how intricately painted and high up these figures extend on the rock wall. And painting these figures just wouldn't have been possible from the ground level without a system of supports. So here you can see the custom scaffolding that Shumla uses in the field to reach these parts of the panel. Producing these murals required a lot of preparation from the artists themselves, so their knowledge of the land would have been essential. Their materials were collected from the landscape around them, including earth pigments, binders from animal fat, and emulsifiers, probably from the yucca plant. And they also would have needed implements for applying these paints, so things like sticks or brushes made from animal hair, plant fibers, or even feathers. And the stalk and leaves of the yucca or the solitol plant could have been shaved down, dried, and utilized as painting implements as well. In this painting test I conducted, I used a variety of different brush sizes to create different widths and types of lines. So for instance, the thick brush at the top here made a more gestural mark. It was a little harder to control because of its size, as opposed to some of these thin brushes down here where I was able to make more precise lines. And just to give a visual of how Lower Pecos artists would have used different sizes or shapes of brushes to create different types of line work. In addition to process and preparation, the mural's location is incredibly significant to the Lower Pecos painters. The composition begins with the earth itself, the materials, and the rock shelter surface. The paintings on these rock walls are alive and part of the landscape, and they change over time. And it's clear from the amount of preparation involved, this included finding a location, building scaffolding, collecting materials, and developing motifs, that these paintings were not arbitrarily made. These works of art would have taken days, if not weeks, to prepare and plan out. And through the research collected by Shumla over many years, they have demonstrated that these works of art are not just a random assemblage of images, but they were actually carefully made compositions made in a specific order. The color order that the artists used was highly significant to the structure of these works of art. This microscopic image of paint layers using a Dynalite digital microscope has shown a consistent order of white over yellow, over red, over black. Above, you can see a microscopic example of the red paint layered over the black paint. And knowing the color order of the paint layers is essential for understanding the complexity of the composition itself. So not only did the Lower Pecos artists physically layer paint to weave in figures at significant portions of the composition, they visually pushed back and brought forward figures with ways of arranging line, shape, and form. Through high-definition images and detailed maps, I was able to begin my analysis of Panther Cave. And in this presentation, I'm going to begin with a compositional analysis. So I'm going to be identifying some important arrangements of space and figures, as well as the location on the rock wall. Then I will highlight some important groups of figures based on some symmetrical relationships or how they interact in a group to signify important parts of the scene. As I hone in on specific sections of the panel, I'm also going to highlight some motifs and how specific marks were made. With the help of some macro photography and some high definition images, I can analyze the way a line might have been painted and the quality of a specific mark. I'm also going to compare these these images with some of painting process tests that I conducted to recreate certain marks and shed light on how the painting process would have happened. So the top image here is a map of the entire Panther Cave mural. Oh, forgive me, sorry, my light turned off. My main analysis will be focused on the large central composition here. And this is a scene of densely layered figures that gradually layer as they near the panel center. Panther Cave, named after the giant feline figure here on the far right end of the site, contains Pecos River pictographic imagery dating back approximately 4,000 years. And the site is situated in Seminole Canyon State Park, is endangered by periodic flooding. It's only accessible by boat. The site contains over 200 figures, and the main panel I'm going to be talking about today spans about 25 meters long and 4 meters high. And also just to note that across the span of this huge site, the color order is consistent throughout. The black, then the red, then the yellow, and then finally the white was applied. The first part of my analysis involves identifying the central composition. So this begins with noting dense figure arrangement, height on the panel, the sizes of the figures, and then also the use of negative space around the scene. This preliminary illustration by Dr. Boyd at the top shows a clear rendering of how the figures increase in size and cluster to the center. The far right feline figure here and the wavy enigmatic figure on the other side serve as framing figures for the scene that unfolds between them. You can see how the scene gradually uses more vertical space on the panel as it builds inward. After analyzing the composition of the panel, I identified this heavily abstracted figure who creates a shift in the compositional arrangement. This anthropomorph facing left is rendered in a profile as a line. And this figure is very unique to the panel in its appearance. The artist simplifies the anthropomorph's body just with a single line to open its body to the negative space around him, rather than having the anthropomorph as a closed form. From this central figure, there's a few key symmetries that I wanted to point out. So as noted earlier, these two framing figures outside of the scene, the feline on the right and the enigmatic form on the left, are the same distance apart from this central anthropomorph. And you can also see these two prominent anthropomorphs are the same distance apart from the center as well. This brushy anthropomorphic figure is approximately the same distance from this rounded anthropomorph on the right. And finally, the anthropomorph with a right-sided wavy line here is approximately the same distance from this wavy line on the other side of the panel. The central abstracted figure in blue initiates a shift in the way that the scene is composed as well. The artist changes both the density of the scene and also the type of mark making on each side. So to the right, you can see more use of negative space between figures, more gestural mark making around and inside figures. And splatter paint, which I'm going to talk about a little later in the presentation, is also used, but it's used in a more atmospheric way. It's less dense, and it's spread apart across parts of the negative space. To the left of this blue abstracted figure, or the figure I have marked in blue, there's a difference in the scene. Figures are densely layered and have more opaque paint, as opposed to the kind of gestural brushy marks on the left side, on the right side. And there are more instances of specific line work and overlapping to create a highly active and dynamic scene. And splatter is a main actor on this side of the scene, interacting with the figures and creating striking visual paths. In this close-up of the right side of the panel, you can see the different ways the artist uses paint application and compositional arrangement. So you can see here the consistent use of negative space between the figures, which I've marked with the yellow arrows, indicates the importance of maintaining the shape and the clarity of these individual forms. And it also gives space for some of that gestural mark making to be a little more evident. In this detail, you can see some of the gestural mark making up close around this anthropomorph. But also note the ability of the artist to make some of these really tightly rendered lines on the feet. And that shows the ability of the artist to switch from a more expressive active application to a more tightly rendered specific line. And the coexistence of these marks together shows the ability of the artist to switch modes from more gestural to more specific. Also note the gestural line surrounding the figure. The artist begins by placing their brush at the top and dragging it down to a tapered end. And this direction of mark making gives the illusion of movement around this anthropomorph. The figures on this side of the panel also have a consistent direction they face. So here I've marked the hip clusters on the left side of their bodies. And then you can also see that each of these figures holds an atlatl in their right hand. These figures appear to be turned in, facing the panel center. The negative space between these figures, again, makes the inward direction of the figures more visible as well. Two figures that I did want to point out on this side of the panel show a really sophisticated use of indicating direction. So the first one I wanted to point out is this figure, the tall anthropomorph here, faces left. And you can tell by his feet, which are facing inward. And this, compared to the anthropomorph to his right, shows a set of forward-facing feet. And this was an intentional choice on behalf of the artist to emphasize the direction facing inward of this figure. And one more I wanted to point out was this smaller anthropomorph here on the panel. And this figure is painted with a 3/4 perspective. The left arm of this anthropomorph reaches across, overlapping his own body to hold the staff. I wanted to shift next to the left part of the panel, and you can see a different approach in the composition. The complex layering of figures creates a visually dense and interwoven scene, as opposed to the right side of the panel, which used negative space and more gestural mark making. These figures are rendered closely together with more refined and specific lines. I included this enhanced D-stretch image, which allows us to see extensive use of the parallel and intersecting lines that are used in this panel. So the first area I wanted to zoom in on was right here. And in this detail, there are thick and thin lines that are painted in different directions. These visually thread together, integrating this part of this scene. Another example, this figure is kind of hard to make out, but it's the feline figure on the left here. And this figure has evenly spaced straight and curved lines extending from the back, which creates a sense of motion and emphasis. One more figure I did want to point out. So behind the black feline, there is an anthropomorph rendered with fine lines. This thin-lined anthropomorph is visually pushed back behind the much bolder, thicker lines and the solid black infill of this feline. To note, though, the artist would have painted the black first and then the red. There's also groupings within the panel that indicate important relationships and some of the shifts in the scene. And I identified the most prominent feline figures in yellow here, and they're marked on the map. These felines are approximately the same height on the panel, but today I'm going to be focusing on the relationship between these two on the left side. The two felines on the left side face inward, and they're mirroring each other. In between these two feline figures are also two large anthropomorphs, and these two anthropomorphs are facing outward rather than inward like the felines. Directly between them is a hollow anthropomorph, and on this anthropomorph's elbow is a line that extends to the right, creating a visual tether to the center of the panel. Also, directly beneath each of these feline figures is a round-shaped figure, and this is another pair in the scene that mirrors each other. Mirroring of figures in this section of the panel would have required a type of measuring tool, ensuring the height and distance were the same across several meters of rock wall. Also note, I just want to point out another instance of perspective. This figure right here, I included a close-up of its head, and you can see that the artist paints this ear on the right a little bit lower than this ear on the left, to give an indication of a specific angle. And this is another subtle use of perspective that gives depth to the feline's head. Moving a little farther left, there's an interesting group of red handprints organized into a top and bottom row. I wanted to include a close-up so you can see some of them. These thickness of paint and precise edges of the fingers and palm wouldn't have likely been made just with a simple handprint of paint. So the artist would have needed to trace or draw out a hand and then fill in the shape with several passes of red paint to achieve the thickness of coverage. Also note, there's a group of hands here on the top right of this image, and these hands are rendered slightly different. They're made with a thick line for the arm and small lines extending for the digits. And the ability of the artist to represent hands in different ways throughout this panel indicates a complex understanding of representation. So the line work and form that the artist chooses varies in the scene, portraying a degree of likeness or anatomical appearance. The artists at Panther Cave take a similar approach with representing feet. So these feet, much like the handprints I talked about in the last slide, are formed to signify an anatomical foot with an oval shape and rounded toes. And to its right, you can see another anthropomorph with front-facing foot and lines for digits. The ability to represent feet or hands in different ways is a complex and conceptual part of image making and shows how the artist was able to represent something in more abstracted or more like life ways or anatomical ways. As mentioned earlier, line is an important element of this panel, executed with great care by the artist throughout the site. Cross-hatching, which is intersecting lines, can be seen in the body of this deer. You can also see it within the main composition itself through overlapping lines that weave together different types of figures. And another element of line used in this panel is parallel lines, and they're used to render hair or used to render paraphernalia, and the negative space, and they're generally used in negative space around figures. And the consistent spacing of lines within the composition would have required a small painting tool and a lot of care from the artist to ensure consistent spacing and thickness of line. In my most recent studies, I've been analyzing the function of splatter paint and abstraction at Panther Cave and its importance to integrating the scene. I've darkened this image a little bit just so you can see the extensive coverage of splatter through this main section, which I have rendered in yellow just to make it a little more visible. For my close study of the splatter marks at Panther, I've identified 3 different types. The first one I identified, which is a splatter arc, follows a single path and curves at the end, creating an arc-like shape. The next type of splatter I identified is fine splatter, which has a speckled mist-like appearance, and it covers the surface pretty consistently. And then the final type of splatter identified is a splatter cluster. These areas don't necessarily follow a trail or a specific path, but sometimes they're irregular and they just cover negative space around figures. In my first studio tests, I tried to recreate some of these types of splatter. So in the image on the left, I was attempted to do a splatter trail, and I did this with close proximity to the surface by flinging the brush loaded with paint. And this required a really strong movement of my arm, and I had to keep a really tight range of motion, and it had to be really close to the surface to do this. And making these tightly controlled splatter paths required quite a bit of physical effort. And the test indicated that not only did the Lower Pecos artists suggest movement with a dynamic splatter mark, but the marks themselves required a lot of physical effort. And the process of bodily movement is key to how we look at these marks. I was challenged by trying to recreate the splatter arcs. It actually took a couple of tests, but over the course of probably 5 or 6 tests, I realized that I needed a much wider range of motion to get that curved path that's seen in Panther Cave. And in the picture on the left, I positioned myself much lower than the surface and tried different angles of flinging the splatter paint higher up. The Lower Pecos painter would have had to position themselves lower down and cast paint up at specific angles to achieve this kind of mark. And this made me think about the kind of relationship that the artist would have with the proximity to their surface. So sometimes the artist would need to be really up close to the panel to create really small marks or details. And then sometimes they would have need to apply splatter or gestural marks from below. By manipulating the painting tool, I was able to achieve the fine mist-like splatter that we see at Panther as well. In this studio test, I flicked the bristles of my brush and let the paint speckle onto the surface. Lower Pecos artists could have used this motion to achieve this effect, or used a hollow tool to blow fine speckles of paint onto the surface. And again, this doesn't really follow a specific path, but it kind of creates an atmospheric space over figures or in the background around figures. And finally, in my last splatter test, I did a splatter cluster test. So I attempted to replicate a region of splatter paint in Panther Cave. And the surface I used here was pretty small. It was about the size of a sheet of printer paper. And the trail mark or cluster and trail marks I built up took me about 80 passes of my brush, and it took me about 4 minutes to apply this amount of paint. And from this test, I was able to recognize the amount of time and intentional movement of the artist that would have been needed to create this amount of splatter. So I wanted to put my test side by side with what the actual area looks like. So again, about the size of a sheet of paper here next to an actual area of splatter that extends several feet high and wide. So according to my 4-minute test, it would have taken much longer to cover this region of several feet wide to cover this large area. So these tests helped me to understand better how the splatter was achieved through this panel and how these marks would have been executed. I wanted to begin on the right side of the scene where the splatter is not as interactive with the figures. It's more in the negative space around the figures. It's more loosely applied and doesn't really follow a specific direction, but it does help integrate this part of the scene. The splatter marks on the left side are primarily splatter arcs, and there's a couple of splatter clusters on the outside of it. The main area I wanted to focus on was around this anthropomorph here, and you can see dozens of trails of the splatter arcs around its head. That, in addition to its hands reaching up, makes the appearance of these splatter trails be radiating out of the figure's head. It is hard to know whether the anthropomorph was painted before or after because they are both red, but it's evident that the highly controlled splatter paths were integral to the figure's action and the way the figure was composed. And as demonstrated in my test, the painter would have needed to be lower down from the panel to apply this high up arc pathway. Splatter plays an important role in this feline figure closer to the center. So to start, I wanted to just demonstrate the paint layers, how they dictated how these figures would have been woven together. So first, the black body of the anthropomorph would have been painted, then the red of the feline. At the same time, the red of the splatter would have been painted, the yellow would have been applied, and then finally, the white would have been applied. Not only is this feline woven into the anthropomorph color-wise, it has significant interactions with the splatter paint that's around it. So the red mist around the head here of the feline is applied. It's applied around the head and on top of the head as well, but it's not as visible beneath the white paint that's inside of this figure's head. And the artist intentionally leaves the lower half of this feline empty, choosing to let the splatter show inside the red outline rather than covering it with white paint. The splatter is more active and it extends upward in a series of trails. The feline is essentially transformed by its intersection with the anthropomorph it's woven into. So the head surrounded by mist splatter and filled in with white. Then the artist paints its torso with thick red paint that is sandwiched by the black and yellow of the anthropomorph's body. And then the other side of the feline, which is painted very differently, a hollow lower half that is covered in dynamic splatter trails. Finally, I wanted to highlight another area of splatter. These two anthropomorphs are facing each other and have different splatter applied by the artist. So this left figure is a tall banded anthropomorph with a unique combination of what we call speech breath coming from its mouth. This gestural brushy line work extends out of the mouth with the splatter dots applied on top to create an active and dense area of speech breath. The anthropomorph to the right is enshrouded by splatter clusters and trails. Its body is activated by the dynamic marks, but also the physical effort that the artist would have expended in making this large amount of splatter across of this area of about 1 meter. In my research, I'm reminded of this quote that I love by art historian George Kubler when discussing works of the past. The shapes of time are the prey we want to capture. A net of another mesh is required, different from any in use now. It's important to challenge our notions of representation and how we interpret the visual. And while honing in on these more expressive and abstract elements of the creative process, I think it's also really important to look at some of the discrete elements of mark making and how these pieces fit in context when they interact with the figures themselves. These images and the marks the artists make hold their own power and significance. In my studio tests, I also discovered that the act of making is just as important as the image. So the physical placement of the body, the movement of the arm, or the effort expended making the mark holds reverence. Panther Cave is an incredibly rich site with a diverse and skilled combination of marks that give each part of the scene meaning. Every aspect of the painting process is significant, whether it's a carefully painted line across the surface or if it's a splatter across the scene. These marks guide the viewer's eye and activate the figures around them. And as we continue to study this amazing art of the Lower Pecos, recognizing the process and the marks themselves, we will continue to discover the layers of meaning encoded in these complex works of art. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me.
And I'm going to take over for just a moment and share that we are in the middle of our $250,000 campaign to raise money for Shumla and for programs like this one. And if you are enjoying these programs and getting benefit from them, please consider donating to Shumla. You can donate at our website. And on that page, it also has a place where you could send a check if you would like to. So now we are going to move into question and answer time. Let me pull this up so that I can see where our questions and answers. Got to find my chat section quick. I covered my screen with Ashley. All right. Oh, it doesn't look like we have any questions currently in the chat. If you had a question or wrote down a question that you want to ask, oh, perfect. Here we are. From Kate York. Ashley, did you find that there was more splatter on the side with a dense amount of figures?
Yes, that's a great question. There was more splatter on that side. The right side, it was loosely applied and it was in fewer areas. So definitely denser on that left side and more interaction with the figures as well, which was really interesting.
From David Reish, could the splatter be representative of water or wind movement or possibly stars?
That's a great question. I mean, we know the artist had such a deep connection with the landscape and with cycles of time. It's hard to know, but we know that connection is there, so it could be.
Awesome. Spider, yes, you may ask your question in person. Feel free to go off mute.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Ashley.
Hi, Spider.
Your dad is no doubt very proud of you. And you have, this presentation was wonderful, and I think you've added significantly to the archaeological canon of understanding more about this artwork from our section. So thank you for that. So I have a question, kind of a compound question. Did you ever attempt to replicate some of these paintings on, say, like a blank shelter rock face, utilizing the methods, the materials and techniques of the ancient artists? And if you did, find those pigments, and I know they've been analyzed and so forth, so you know what they are. Mm-hmm. How do they compare to contemporary paint pigments and brushes?
Yeah, no, that is a great question. I have not conducted that research. I know Carolyn has. It is something I definitely want to pursue. Currently, I don't have access to a site where I could do that where I am now, but it's something I really want to pursue in the future, is expanding the size that I do these tests on, and a rock wall that would really kind of mimic that surface that they would have painted on.
Well, if Carolyn's handy still, I'm not going to answer that question, because it occurred to me that those results could be compared and so forth.
Well, I think in answer to your question, Spider, I've only done it on a small scale. I haven't done it on a large scale yet, but that's something that I would really like to see. I'd love to get Ashley into a real rock shelter in the Lower Pecos and have her go through those processes, and also for us to involve maybe engineers and others to figure out how they develop the scaffolding to go about reaching these high points. So that's all future research.
Thank you very much. Good job, ladies.
Thank you, Spider.
We have a question from Carolyn Tate. Could multiple artists be involved in making figures and also splatter?
Absolutely. It's from the marks, you can see likely where one artist was working on a figure, but at a site with this scale, artists would have had to work together, especially at the height they were working on as well. But those artists would have worked very in sync with each other to make sure that the style was consistent, that the images were interwoven correctly with the paint order. But absolutely, I think that could have happened here.
Wonderful. Another one from Scott. Do you have any idea how many individuals worked on each painting?
That we can't know. If, you know, with the site, again, this size, it probably was more than one artist, but it is hard to tell just based on what we see in the imagery. We do know that the style is consistent. So if it was more than one artist, they were trained to make the same kind of marks to make sure that the panel was painted consistently.
From Jillian Conrad, is there evidence of the artist or artists practicing these mark-making gestures beforehand? They seem so specific and purposeful.
Well, that's a great question. From my observations, I didn't see of this panel specifically. I don't know if there were any like underdrawing instances or kind of mapping out. But it's hard to like say if an artist was able to make something of this size and scale without having a plan. I know, I don't know if there's been an instance at another site where there was like kind of a sketching in. Carolyn, do you know of anything at another site where that's?
There are some sites I can think of, some examples at Cedar Springs and at Halo Shelter, where I've seen some possible appearance of maybe a sketch, a preliminary sketch that was done underneath. But you know, the biggest problem is that they've been heavily overpainted since then, so it's hard to see those underlying drawings. But surely planning would have, some kind of planning had to have gone into it.
Awesome. From Christy, I love the combination of your tests being visible with the actual cave art. How has this inspired your surfaces? And what has it done for you in your studio practice?
Ooh, that's a great question. Thanks, Christy. It's definitely making me think about how paint interacts with surface and what I work on dimensional surfaces as well. So it really makes me think about how that surface activates the mark versus it being on a flat surface. The splatter test really kind of opened a new part of my brain that I'm going to take with me to the studio. Kind of that thought of not directly applying the brush mark and kind of that, what does that movement do for kind of that more next to some of that more intentional mark making. So that's something I'm definitely going to explore when I have a chance to get back to my studio.
Robin, it looks like you have your hand up. Go ahead and ask your question.
So I was interested in the hip clusters on slide 20.
Mhm.
I've never seen those before. What are they? What do they represent, do you think?
I actually might turn this over to Carolyn. I know she's a little more versed in the meaning of the hip cluster. We do see them associated with the atlatl in most cases, but she might be able to give a little more clarity on that. Trying to go back to that slide so we can see it.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I understood the question. I had to jump up to answer my door. So are you asking about what the hip cluster might represent?
Yes.
Okay, we wish we knew.
Oh, I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is we have the hip clusters only in a very limited geographic area. It's in Seminole Canyon and in just a canyon just nearby that holds a site called Painted Shelter. But we don't have it outside of that area. So it seems to be, you know, very, maybe perhaps some kind of a territorial thing, you know, tied to a specific group, particular type of ceremony, perhaps, that was conducted. And that may end up giving us the clue as to what this mural is about. In that, if there is a reason for depicting them with these particular bodily, you know, accoutrements for a specific ceremony at a specific time, it might help us to get some understanding of what the story is telling. But as Ashley was saying, what we've learned is that this site was painted following that black, red, yellow, white rule, which means that this is not a random collection of images painted over thousands of years, but over a relatively short, a huge mural, but a relatively short period of time. So the opportunity for interpretation is ripe.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. A question from Steve Davis. Excellent and amazing research. Would additional insight be gained by using replica brushes rather than modern tools?
Absolutely. I think Steve read my mind here. That's on my list of things to explore next is finding natural materials and seeing kind of how that changes the way that I conduct my studio tests. I am using, you know, paint from the paint store, but I am trying to get the thickness to be as viscous as possible to kind of recreate some of this, but it's definitely on my list of something to explore next.
Thanks. We have two people who've asked about this, about the way that water is affecting Panther Cave, and about the flooding. And one asked about any photographs that is showing this effect. And I have two photographs that I could pull up super quick.
Yeah, let me stop sharing.
Oh, Emil, can you show me as secure? Awesome. And let me just show these super fast. So you can see, hopefully you can see this. This is the water in Seminole Canyon, and it has risen so much that it's almost to the actual sign that shows the beginning of Seminole Canyon. And then this one shows it from the outside. So as you can imagine, every time the water gets this high, it causes silt and stones and things to be left in the canyon. So the water level continues to rise. So as when flooding does occur and it reaches the point, at this point, with the new gravels and rocks, it'll be higher. And so that is really the problem that we're dealing with across the landscape, is the siltation of these canyons causing water levels to be much higher during flood stage. All right, let me stop sharing. And then next question. Let me make sure I'm getting everybody. On the side of the panel with more negative space, was there also white paint, or did they replace each other? That's from Kate York. And if I didn't explain it right, feel free to go off mute and ask it.
Yeah, no, I think I know
Okay.
what this is referring to, kind of the play of either negative space or white paint, kind of that additive or not adding. We do see white on the left side of the panel with that more concentrated area. We also see white on the right side of the panel with some more of that negative space. So I think it really is just a choice of the artist whether or not they want to additively add that white or leave the rock wall the color that it, or leave the rock wall bare. But it kind of has a different implication than, like, you know, we start from a white piece of paper, and so adding white is different than adding white onto a rock. White served as just another color. But that's a really great question. Kind of that interaction of negative space and white and what those two things mean, like in coexistence.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is harder to see the white paint because it seems to have deteriorated faster than the other colors, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't just as much. And I think that Ashley and Carolyn and the team are getting closer and closer to understanding how much white there was. With the renderings they're doing and the studies that they're doing, it will be fascinating to see how negative space versus white paint was utilized. Next, we have curiosity question from David Eisen. And this may be not one that Ashley knows the answer to, but maybe Carolyn could throw in some ideas here too. For over the 4,000-year period that this painting was being done, at this cave, for example, do we know how much of the floor would have eroded away such that the top of the painting would have been closer to the ground when painted?
So there is it's the possibility of cemented gravels and things. We've got what are called cemented gravels in the shelter right now that indicates at some point the floor was a little bit higher. But from everything I've been told by the geoarchaeology people that have been into that site, they don't think that that floor has changed that much. In other words, when they did the paintings, that floor was where it is now. It was not up on the wall, but certainly many, 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 many tens of thousands of years before that, it is entirely possible, and definitely it was. But at the time that they did the mural, it was where it is. And this is based some on what you've got in the archaeological deposits beneath those paintings as well, that you can kind of make those decisions.
Thank you.
Awesome, great question. Ashley, you've been getting a lot of kudos that we'll show you when you see the chat. So thank you to everyone who's been saying how wonderful Ashley's presentation is. A question from Hannah Gardner. Were any of the panels repainted over time, either to change the images or to repair the images?
I know there are instances of that, especially with some of the historic painting styles we see where figures are added at a later time. I don't think there's an instance of that in this panel from what we've dated, but it certainly does happen in some of the murals in this area. I might pass it to Carolyn. I'm sorry again, if you have any more information on that.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is, did they ever go back in and touch up? And the interesting thing at Panther Cave, we don't see it a lot, or at least not that we've been able to identify. But at Panther Cave, there's one case that is just so much fun to look at, because it's an image of a deer, and on the head of the deer, so it's a red deer, that the head of the deer has been incised with probably a piece of flint. We call that post-painting modification, where they've just gone in and they've just purposefully incised right along the head. At some point later, they came back with a lighter red-orange paint and painted the head back in. So you've got the dark red, then you've got the post-painting modification, and then you've got the lighter red that goes on top of it. That's sweet stuff.
Thank you. Has there been any study as to the degradation? This is from T. Beavers. The degradation of the different colors with exposure to light. Which paints are degrading faster from sunlight?
I know there's a huge portion of this panel that has accretion on it, and I don't know if the sunlight directly affects the paint saturation or color itself. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if we're able to tell that from what we see on the panel, but definitely something to think about. I know the artist did consider, the sun like hitting the panels as part of, that weaving back into the landscape and being part of that cycle. So definitely something to consider, because the artist considered that as well.
Yeah, and I don't know that we've done experimentation on that yet, but there are panels in the Lower Pecos that get sunlight every single day, and there are others that are very rarely, if ever, in the sunlight. So definitely something to look at. And as Margolith mentioned here in the notes, some colors also bond better to the rock than others. So their strength of opacity and brightness may not just solely be based on sunlight or degradation or accretion or what have you. But you guys are asking so many fascinating questions. I feel like we should hire most of you to come and do experiments. All right, let's go. Let's do 2 more. Let's see. Thank you, Ashley and Shumla. Very interesting to learn about the techniques used by the original makers and how Ashley has explained and demonstrated them. Actually, it looks like that may have been the last question in the chat. Do we have anybody that wants to ask one last question verbally?
Is there any narrative to the like the panel itself? Does anyone have like any ideas about a narrative?
It might be a great question for Carolyn.
Well, I wish we could say that we do have a narrative for that panel, but we don't as yet. But you know, we're learning so much right now. A bit, it's things are just unfolding so rapidly. But just stay tuned. That's what I would say at this point. There's more to come.
All right. Well, we will hopefully see you next month. So glad that you joined us. And yeah, thanks for being here. And thank you, Ashley. Fantastic
Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. Thank you.